Hi, I'm Cameron.
And I'm Hayden.
And this is
Until the End of Crime. Cameron, have you or anyone that you know ever been romantically involved with someone who just seemed to bring out the worst in their partner?
Yes, I have known people to have dynamics that are not highlighting their most positive qualities or attributes.
When you say that, it makes me think of the Reba McEntire song, The Fear of Being Alone. And it's a song that highlights how people will start and enter and remain in relationships out of the fear that they can't find something else or something better.
But I think that people do that.
They do.
I think that
100%.
plenty of people do that.
Yeah, I agree. I think for me, the saddest form of bringing out the worst in each other is when someone enters into a relationship and part of their identity gets lost. As a former teacher, I feel like I saw that a lot, where these young people were so willing to take elements of their personality and who they were and put them to the side for somebody else. Or in instances where someone begins to engage in behavior, like one of the most specific cases that sticks out in my mind is, well, and as terrible as it sounds, I feel like it happens to women more than men. I think that women in heterosexual relationships are typically the ones that have to bend and mold themselves to fit more of what their partner wants.
To the point that you're making, I have seen where the women in the relationship, if it's a heterosexual relationship, has to make more compromise or sacrifice at that point than it...
Sacrifices, concessions.
Concessions. That is probably more what I was going for.
Yeah. But I mean, and I guess by the same token, oftentimes I do think that men probably give up small concessions too, right? But usually I think that looks more like, oh no, my freedom, right? Quotes, freedom.
Right.
Has been diminished to some degree.
Yes, I have had friends in the past who I think are in a relationship with somebody who they kind of want to still be single, but they don't want to be alone. So they want to be able to go drinking with their friends or go hang out and do whatever it is on the weekend that they enjoy doing, but they don't want to come home to an empty bed. And it ends up being really unfair to the other person in the relationship.
Some of this conversation is really making me think of this concept of relationships, both being parasitic, but also sometimes parasitic and symbiotic.
Symbiotic, yeah.
And today's story is actually a love story predicated on that kind of toxic, symbiotic, let's bring out the worst in each other kind of relationship.
Do you think people set out to bring out the worst in each other, or that's just how they...
I think that is a common hallmark of people who enter relationships because they want to feel whole versus entering in a relationship because they already feel whole and they're looking for someone to complement them. I think it's easy to fall into that kind of cyclical pattern if you feel like a relationship is going to complete part of you versus complement part of you. But yeah, that's what I think about it. In 1986, 23-year-old out lesbian Gwen Graham...
Out lesbian.
It was 1986.
That's fair.
Homosexuality had been a mental illness only 13 years before she was an out lesbian in this story. I think 1973 was when it was no longer considered a mental disease, a mental illness. Okay, anyway.
It was considered a mental illness before Stonewall?
Yeah, it was
So police were raiding clubs looking for illegal behavior, and then they were also technically raiding the clubs that a community that was currently deemed mentally ill would frequent. What?
So in 1952, the first DSM said that homosexuality was a sociopathic personality disturbance. DSM-2, which came out in 1968, had homosexuality listed as a mental disorder. Then The DSM-2 revision in 1974 said that homosexuality was replaced with the category of sexual orientation disturbance. Now, in 1973, the APA Board of Trustees voted to remove the diagnosis of homosexuality from the DSM after comparing theories that pathologized homosexuality with those that viewed it as normal. Gay rights activists challenged the classification of homosexuality as a mental disorder during the gay liberation movement following the 1969 Stonewall riots. Some activists, like Ronald Gold, disrupted panels and gave speeches at APA conferences, calling out the APA for creating sickness where there was none. In 1987, the diagnosis was finally removed from the DSM altogether.
So that sickness where there was none is kind of my point. If at that time this was in the psychology field, it was considered a quote unquote sickness, and the police were going to places and raiding venues that were catering to the sick. If that's really if that's the way that it was framed at the point, and that to me is, I mean, it was always awful, but that is even worse, because
or it just indicates that they knew all along that it wasn't a mental illness.
Right,
they just
but
disagreed with it.
That makes it all worse.
I know. Well,
it's all terrible. Better.
It's not good under any circumstance.
Oh my God. I'm so mad.
So, really, to contextualize this story, in 1986, when Gwen Graham was an out lesbian, she was an out lesbian while it was still considered to be a mental illness by the DSM. However, anyways.
Moving on.
Gwen Graham met Cathy Wood, a 24-year-old married woman with a young daughter named Jackie. Cathy had been having trouble in her marriage, because
it was to a man.
Well,
assumably, you haven't said that, but assumably, if homosexuality was still considered an illness, I imagine that she was not married to a woman.
Well, the problems in the marriage were really defined by what her husband thought, which was that Cathy really had several shortcomings as a mother and a wife. Probably that she was attracted to women.
I don't know that would have really affected her role as a mother.
Well, we'll explore that a little more. Cathy and Gwen both worked at Alpine Manor Nursing Home in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Gwen had recently moved to Grand Rapids from Texas and had accepted a position as a nurse's aide, while Cathy was her superior. I do want to note that not every source refers to Cathy as being over Gwen at any point. Instead, they're both classified as nurses' aides, so it's really hard to say which is accurate because there's reporting that states that both are true.
Right.
Cathy really quickly took to Gwen's presence and friendship, and romantic feelings quickly developed, and Gwen and Cathy started a whirlwind romance. Their personal lives and professional lives merged, and they spent all of their waking moments together, as well as many of the hours where one would rest. As Cathy fell more in love with Gwen, her marriage fell further into disrepair. As Cathy and Gwen's love grew, so did their intense, seemingly toxic romance. Gwen was known to be possessive, often bending Cathy to her will. Other times, Cathy and Gwen would enter bouts of physical violence. It was even reported that one evening that after Cathy and Gwen had gone dancing somewhere, that Gwen was very upset that Cathy had danced with another woman. And
what year is this?
1986.
And we're in Grand Rapids, Michigan?
Yes.
Home of Orion's Story?
Yeah.
Was the gay scene hopping in Grand Rapids, Michigan? And
they did have a gay bar
that
seemed to have business.
Drag queens?
I have no idea.
We can only hope.
So that night when they got home, Gwen grabbed Cathy by the hair after striking her repeatedly and drug her by her hair into their bedroom. Other reports indicate that Cathy had a habit of intentionally egging Gwen on. Now, there is no excuse for any kind of domestic violence, but I do think from everything I've read that Cathy and Gwen never had a healthy relationship dynamic. Their dysfunction fed each other's dysfunction.
Yeah.
Ultimately, though, the two women greatly enjoyed bonding and spending time together.
Did I miss her leaving her husband?
She did leave her husband.
Did I zone out? Did you say that?
No.
Okay.
I said It led to the further dissolution of their marriage,
Right.
but I didn't explicitly say she had left her husband.
Okay.
And to be honest, I don't know if she had fully left her husband, because he's going to come back and play a role later that leads me to believe that they weren't divorced.
Yeah, they were probably still married, but she did not stay in the home.
Right. He plays an interesting part in this story and kind of juxtaposes what Cathy has going on with Gwen.
Okay. Sorry, can you also remind me their ages
Yes.
in 86?
Gwen is 23.
23.
Cathy is 24.
Oh.
Very close in age.
Very close in age.
So part of this enjoying this bonding together and being so kind of in love with each other, they really desired opportunities to commit acts that would strengthen and sanctify their relationship. And many of these activities would occur at Alpine Manor.
When you say commit acts, it makes me think that the acts are illegal.
Some of them are fine and dandy.
Commit just carries that tone with it.
Well, so for instance, Cathy and Gwen would take turns hiding under patients' beds, and then they would grab passerby nurses' ankles to scare them.
Yeah, there's a pathology going on there.
They loved doing that together. They loved grabbing random nurses' ankles to scare them from under the patients' beds.
And it has nothing to do with homosexuality. There is a pathology there.
There is mental illness, but it's nothing.
Well, I can't diagnose that. I am not qualified, but
I can only diagnose people that I'm seeing professionally. But I do, and I can diagnose, but only with people I see. I want to shift gears a little bit and kind of take you through a quick conversation about care options for the elderly or for older people. So in today's world...
Is this an ad?
No. I just want to kind of contextualize what options existed and what Alpine Manor was.
Gotcha.
Because if we're talking about modern day care for the elderly, there are all different kinds of levels of care, different operations. You can have a nursing home, or what might be referred to as a skilled nursing facility, or a SNF. There is assisted living facilities, or what's sometimes referred to as an ALF. There are personal care homes where you enter into someone's private residence and live with them, and you're cared for almost like it's a SNF, but there's no medical personnel. And when we're talking about 1986, there were few options. If there was a nursing home, you were doing great. That was a great option to have. The care did not, or was not, largely regulated at that time. And it wasn't uncommon for SNFs or ALFs to have more than 100 patients or 100 residents.
To how many medical professionals?
I don't think there was any kind of
regulation.
Right. I don't think there was a ratio that existed that was very protective. And when we talk about Alpine Manor, it was considered to be kind of the cream of the crop that was in Grand Rapids, Michigan. It was a great place for elderly people who needed assistance or constant care. One of those people was a woman named Marguerite Chambers. Marguerite Chambers was known as a kind and hardworking woman. She had developed Alzheimer's and was admitted to Alpine Manor Nursing Home by her family. And her family believed that they had found the most excellent and attentive facility possible. The most important thing to Marguerite was her family. Her daughter, Jan Hunderman, really echoes this sentiment in License to Kill, Season 2, Episode 8. And she really highlights how much her mother emphasized her relationships with her loved ones. And I think one of the more touching and also saddening stories that she shared about Marguerite was that when Jan got married for the first time to her first husband, her family, or she, had forgotten the reception napkins for after her wedding. And this was in 1970. And everyone had already arrived at the reception hall. And her mother, Marguerite, said, "You know what? It's no big deal. I'll run home and grab them and come back." And Marguerite went all the way home and came all the way back. And when she returned, she said, "I know I went home to get something, but I can't remember what it was." And that's when her family really understood that she had developed Alzheimer's.
And that was in 1970.
1970.
And we are now talking about her in 1986.
Correct. Well, Jan laments kind of the sadness of her mother's loss of liveliness and personhood. She talked about how comforted she was to be placing her mother at Alpine Manor. They knew that she would be well cared for. They knew that she would be tended to, and that brought them a lot of relief. So Marguerite was admitted to Alpine Manor in July of 1985. So 15 years after they really had a strong inkling that her mother had developed Alzheimer's.
Don't people with Alzheimer's die of Alzheimer's?
Yeah.
To me, I was surprised at the 15 to 16 years. How quickly does that?
So disease progression can vary wildly, and it also, so dementia and Alzheimer's is a form of dementia, and sometimes that comes on as a later diagnosis. Also, people can see signs of particular forms of dementia years and years and years before the disease manifests so strongly that action has to be taken or that a person can no longer care for themselves.
Okay.
You can, symptoms sometimes present themselves 20 years before the disease is to a point that action has to be taken.
That's concerning.
I think about it every time I can't think of a word.
Mm-hmm. Every time you walk into a room and don't remember what you were going in there for.
When your brain just resets.
Like yesterday when I went to leave to go host a baby shower, and I had remembered that I needed something from the kitchen bar area, but I couldn't remember what it was until I got out to my car and realized that it was my purse with my car keys.
Yeah. Yeah, just like that.
Okay.
It's concerning.
Yeah.
Even though we know it happens to people and it happens frequently and it shouldn't be necessarily a cause for concern, now that I have worked with a population that experiences senility and dementia and Alzheimer's,
it's real.
one of the things that has come from it is I listen to people's voices and how softly they talk, because one of the markers and indications of Parkinson's disease development is a softened voice, a quieter voice. And so I find myself listening when people talking and asking myself, does that sound like Parkinson's voice? Does that sound abnormally quiet? There's so many different components that are a part of these aging diseases that I feel like I'm hyper aware of now. Marguerite's daughter, Jan, recalls a time that she went to visit her mother, and she noticed that her mother's face was dirty, and Jan got a wet washcloth and she attempted to wipe her mother's face clean. And she describes her mother as recoiling from her touch and immediately going into a state of flailing and being really, really distressed, and her eyes had widened. She could tell that her mother was just incredibly frightened of what was happening. And Jan did find this really concerning. She went to the administrators of Alpine Manor and tried to find out, why is my mother so scared to have someone touch her face? And the administrators didn't present Jan with any kind of substantial or helpful answers, just a reassurance that her mother's hygiene and cleanliness would be taken care of.
Even though she's indicating that she's probably experienced some sort of violence or very aggressive handling of
Very
her.
aggressive face washing.
Yeah, well, physical contact.
Right. Well, and that's the complicated part when we talk about someone with advanced Alzheimer's, because what is the reaction to? Is it just to that stimulus at all? What are they imagining? To what level of dementedness are they experiencing? And so I think that for me personally, I would feel terrible. I would be concerned, but I also would probably justify it to myself by saying, well, my mother has advanced Alzheimer's. Roughly 12 to 18 months after this incident, Marguerite did pass. Typical old age and Alzheimer's. Nothing of concern. Then, on October 7th, 1988, retired detective, well, he wasn't retired at the time, but now he's retired.
Yeah.
Tom Freeman.
That's his hobby. He's retired, but he just comes in to investigate.
Well, at this point, there was nothing to investigate.
To detect.
So, Tom Freeman, this detective for the Walker Police Department, met with Ken Wood, the spouse of Cathy Wood. He was very upset. He claimed that his now ex-wife, Cathy Wood, had come to him and shared that she was involved in a series of homicides at Alpine Manor and that she didn't know what to do.
Probably not be involved in homicides? Is that an option? Was that on the table?
Too late. What really struck Detective Freeman was how preposterous this sounded. The story of Cathy Wood having been involved in homicides at a nursing home. And
where you assume that people are protected and cared for, and
who would ever harm the elderly or those with disabilities? But what also struck Detective Freeman,
stay tuned,
was the sincerity that Ken portrayed when he explained his concerns. Kenwood would also go on to explain that he and Cathy shared a daughter together, but that Cathy had never displayed any type of motherly instincts or skills. And ultimately, that lack of motherly instinct was what drove them to divorce. I don't know what role her lesbianism played in their divorce, but Ken points to the fact that Cathy just didn't know how to be a mom. Ken also shared with Detective Freeman that Cathy had suffered from various emotional problems. And when Detective Freeman heard this, he also developed another level of skepticism. How could he trust a report from or an ex-husband of a woman with known mental problems about something as serious as homicide at a nursing home?
Well, I think that you hear about homicide and then you investigate that because regardless of the circumstances surrounding it or surrounding the source of the information, we probably investigate homicide.
It's a report of homicide.
Right.
Well,
of a population that needs protecting.
Detective Freeman didn't believe it. He didn't believe it, and neither did his partner, Detective Roger Kaliniak, who is now also a former detective of the Walker Police Department. And what Roger Kaliniak asked himself, and what he asked Detective Freeman, who would kill disabled people?
I would like to know the answer to that question.
Well, no one, silly. That's what Detective Freeman and Detective Kaliniak were saying. Who would kill disabled people? They couldn't believe it, and they didn't. Detective Freeman deduced that Cathy was most likely just trying to get back at somebody who still worked at Alpine Manor with her. Someone that she just wasn't close to anymore. However,
what was the status of Cathy and Gwen's relationship?
So at this point, Cathy and Gwen were no longer together. Detective Freeman knew he had to investigate. He knew that despite his disbelief about the story, that he still needed to at least look into it. So he made his way to Alpine Manor, and when he arrived, he approached the head administrator and essentially questioned, "Where's Cathy Wood? I need to visit with her. Also, do you think there's anything strange about how many people have died here recently?" To which the administrator said that Cathy was an upstanding employee. She had a fantastic record, and no, there was nothing unusual about any of their disabled or elderly residents dying.
There was nothing unusual about the excessive deaths that had been taking place at Alpine Manor.
No, it was all totally normal. And now, granted, as someone who goes into these facilities quite frequently now, death is common.
You work hospice.
I'm just saying that when we're talking about these situations,
they're dying.
Well, older people do die. Older people with diseases do die, and they do it pretty frequently.
You work hospice.
Okay,
people there are...
I'm just entertaining
moving in a very specific direction.
That maybe the administrator really didn't think anything was odd about it.
Was it a hospice facility?
Not hospice specifically.
And there was no increase in numbers?
Maybe a small bump. The administrator did connect Detective Freeman with Cathy Wood, who was working at the facility at the time. And when Cathy came to visit and she noticed that it was Detective Freeman of the police department, all that Cathy asked was if she would be able to retrieve her jacket before they left. So Cathy willingly went with him, and when they arrived to the Walker Police Department, Detective Freeman just openly shared with Cathy everything that her ex-husband had said. Cathy's response was, "Oh, Tom, that was just a joke. I didn't mean that. I was just being silly with my ex-husband. No one committed any kind of homicide at Alpine Manor."
What?
And
no. No, not silly me. I shouldn't have made that joke about murdering people in the facility.
Cathy was just having a fun time. What's entertainingly ironic is that Detective Freeman, despite not initially believing Kenwood's story, thought, "Oh, this is odd. Who would joke about this?" and then pushed Cathy harder, questioning why she would have joked about something so sinister, so evil, so severe as the murdering of nursing home residents. And if it was a joke, why would her ex-husband have wasted 3 hours of his time and Detective Freeman's time by coming and sharing that story with him? Because Kenwood was sincere. He was worried. And when Detective Freeman posed this line of questioning, Cathy changed her story yet again. This time Cathy offered that maybe sinicide, geronticide, or gerontocide are all acceptable forms of elderly-specific homicide. Heretofore will be referred to as sinicide.
Yeah, because it sounds sinister.
Still, she stated, I didn't do it. It was Gwen Graham. She was my lover, and she suffocated patients. Cathy would explain that she was entirely in love with Gwen Graham, and she took more comfort and pleasure in being with Gwen than she ever did with her ex-husband Ken. And after Gwen would kill somebody, they would come home and have sex. Detective Kaliniak explained to Cathy that the sexual activities that followed each of these sinicides was a, quote, release, unquote, for Gwen. Now, for the life of me, when I was watching this docuseries episode and Detective Kaliniak was talking about how he explained that it was a release to Cathy, I found myself questioning, what does he mean by release? What is that in reference to? Is he talking about some kind of cathartic experience? So I'm kind of curious, from your forensic psychology background, why would a couple, after killing an elderly resident in a nursing home, go home and have sex? And what does he mean by release?
So it's not so much about the victim, because I think the victims here are of opportunity. You know that it's a population that is probably not going to raise any eyebrows as they're dying, to the point that you made earlier. The release is that, and I don't know the method of killing, but obviously the act of taking somebody else's life is a power play of sorts. And very often, I think, in the brain, that type of power dynamic creates this high. And so when you're in that heightened state of, I imagine there's adrenaline that goes into it. There's this almost this like God complex that is at play. Murder and sexual arousal very often go hand in hand, I think, because of the areas of the brain that are triggered during those acts.
Well, professionals on the internet really agree with a lot of your assessment. The idea is that power and control are really appealing to people with certain personality traits or certain personality disturbances, as well as that psychosexual gratification. What areas of their brain lights up when they take a life being entangled with their arousal system? And I think that there is also an element of Cathy and Gwen's relationship, and of course, we've only scratched the surface, but we know that it's believed that Gwen at this point was very possessive.
You mentioned that Cathy would egg Gwen on.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I am thinking that if Gwen is pushed to the point where she is becoming physically violent, that is that power dynamic. And I imagine what that ultimately leads to is probably a very intense sexual experience after the fact as things are resolving. And so I like it all kind of is the same type of dynamic producing the same result that Cathy is benefiting from.
Yeah. And I think it definitely reaffirms the duality of their relationship in terms of Gwen is in control. She is the power holder, and Cathy is her submissive. And there is that ownership, there is that control. Those things just too perfectly intertwine with the taking of a person's life. Really insightful. Cathy's interview also led to the admission of some other more specific information that day. Gwen had suffocated Marguerite and several other patients at Alpine Manor. Detective Freeman asked Cathy to tell him about Marguerite Chambers. Cathy stated that Gwen had shared that she, quote, used a washcloth, placed it underneath her chin, and held it up and pinched her nose. Now, me personally, I don't understand exactly what's being described here, but it doesn't sound like an effective way to suffocate or asphyxiate somebody.
Well, if we're talking about a population who is not as strong as they used to be, and I think that if you walk into a nursing home, and you can probably speak to this more than me, but it is not uncommon to see the residents of the nursing home with their mouths open. And so the placing of the washcloth is, one, you're creating a barrier and it's not direct contact. It also probably, if somebody were to walk by, looks less suspicious. It almost looks like you may be
wiping her face.
But you're talking about people who are not able to fight back. And so the closing of the nostrils, you're preventing them from being able to breathe. And they don't have the same physical strength to defend themselves against this action, even though it does seem very casual and not very aggressive.
I think that's... So I totally agree with everything you just said, minus the part about my personal experience. But I do know that it's common for people with Alzheimer's disease or dementia to develop dysphagia, where they're not able to swallow and they do lose control of some of those motor functions that are those finer skills. So that does absolutely make sense. I guess for me, when I think about committing a crime like murder, which I mean, I don't think about committing murder.
That's a lie, but continue.
But if I were talking about in this context, it just feels like such an ineffective way to do it. Like if I was going to kill somebody, I would want to do it quickly. And so for me, this idea, it's such a juxtaposition. I'm going to gingerly place this washcloth under your chin and use it to pick up your chin and then hold your nose. It just feels like too passive.
You are in control of this person's life. There is probably nothing more intense that you could exert control over than to take the life of somebody else.
Right.
So regardless of how non-violent the crime may seem, that's probably also detective's point. What's his name? Detective
Freeman or Detective Kaliniak.
Detective Kaliniak is who I believe you said was trying to explain to Cathy the release. The sexual
yes,
release.
That was Detective Kaliniak.
That's where the physical part is coming into play. That is the release, because you're saying that you would want it to be quick. Obviously, there are quicker ways, but there are more suspicious ways if it's quick.
Right.
And so I think that the going home and the celebrating or the engaging in a sexual act to, I guess, commemorate the murder that you just committed. Yeah. I don't know. I don't really want to ascribe a lot of positive language to that, but
right. But from their perspective, that's what it would be. Not that it's a celebration, but that might be how
I guess
Gwen Graham felt.
Yeah.
Also, the first time that Gwen killed Marguerite was unsuccessful. She came back an hour later and she was alive. She thought she had killed her.
So she held a washcloth to her face and the daughter came and did the washcloth thing.
Well, and I discuss it later, but Cathy admits at a later time that's something, well, Cathy never admits that she did those acts, but that Gwen would kind of go around and suffocate them just for fun, but not kill them.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So I guess if we're talking about that power dynamic, there's probably something incredibly gratifying about almost killing somebody and then deciding that they get to live.
Oh, yeah.
Cathy Wood said that she knew all of these things because Gwen had told her, not because she had witnessed them. She also shared that she was totally in love with Gwen and that she would do anything that Gwen would tell her to. Cathy had married young, and she had been unhappy for most of it. She met Gwen while compiling notes on patients, and again reiterated that they fell in love quickly. But Cathy, again, still true to her initial statement, said that she had nothing to do with the actual murdering of the patients, and that's why she and Gwen had broken up. Cathy stated that Gwen had met a new girlfriend, Heather, and they had moved to Tyler, Texas together.
Gwen love-bombed the shit out of Cathy.
Yeah, seemingly. Mm-hmm. After Cathy confessed to Gwen's act of killing Marguerite Chambers, she began to elaborate and share about several of the other sinicides. During this time of confession, Cathy maintained she had nothing to do with the murders, that she simply knew about them. Cathy also voiced that she wanted to be removed from this narrative as much as possible, as she had not taken part in the killing of these elderly patients. Cathy is really doing a lot of work to try and avoid being fingered for this crime. Detective Freeman's intuition was now leading him to believe Cathy, at least as far as the murder of all of these residents of Alpine Manor. He briefly excused himself from his office to go and speak with his captain, who responded, "This whole thing's full of bullshit. You're wasting your time. Why are you still entertaining this? And unfortunately, Detective Freeman didn't have enough evidence to arrest Cathy, which he felt would be necessary to get her to share more, and to share more honestly. Detective Freeman knew that he was going to need to prioritize finding real concrete evidence that could be used to make an arrest. And that following day, Detective Freeman contacted Alpine Manor again. They informed him that Cathy Wood had been fired, and Detective Freeman was at least somewhat relaxed because he knew that Gwen Graham was in Texas, and he knew that Cathy was no longer working at Alpine Manor. So he had some comfort in knowing that there was no one murdering at Alpine Manor for at least the time being.
Right, but where was Gwen murdering?
Assumably, she couldn't stop herself.
No.
The next day, Cathy Wood ended up sharing more information and the names of employees that she was close to. When she started at Alpine Manor, she became friends with several of the people that she noted, and ultimately, they would provide damning information. These people worked together and played together, and they intertwined their lives more so than Detective Freeman had assumed they would have. And over the course of Cathy and Gwen's year-long relationship, they continually put themselves in situations where these friends of theirs were able to see and make note of the way they interacted with each other. And that's where the information about Gwen striking Cathy and dragging her by the hair came from. And it was also these friends who elucidated on the possessiveness of Gwen, and how when they would go out to the gay bar called the Carousel, that it seemed sometimes like Gwen and Cathy would engage in a behavior of trying to intentionally make the other jealous. So while they were out, it seemed like both of them would kind of tit for tat, trying to make the other upset that they were talking to another woman. Another of these friends that they both worked with and did social activities with reported that one night, Gwen got so mad at a girl who had come on to Cathy that she beat her. Several months later, Cathy and Gwen's relationship ended. Gwen quit Alpine Manor and moved to Tyler, Texas with Heather Barriger. Detective Freeman was able to convince his chief to finance his and the deputy chief's travels to Tyler, Texas. The Tyler Police Department asked Gwen if she was involved with the murders of patients at Alpine Manor, and Gwen quickly stated that Cathy was a liar and a manipulator and aimed to break up Gwen and Heather's burgeoning relationship. So when the Tyler Police made their efforts to kind of initially question Gwen, that was her immediate response. I didn't kill anybody, and Cathy has made all of this up to punish me, which I think is an odd response to someone asking if you've murdered somebody.
It is. It also is just ironic that, I mean, it's one of those things where she's pointing the finger at Cathy, but all of the other ones are pointing back at herself. Like, oh, she's a liar and a manipulator, and she's just saying all the things that she is.
Right. Gwen was so confident in herself and her answers that she immediately agreed to a polygraph on the spot. And when she was questioned about Marguerite Chambers' death, Gwen responded that she had nothing to do with it. The results came out inconclusive. Detective Freeman had not found any solid evidence, and he was kind of back to this place of understanding there was very little that he could do.
I mean, polygraphs are crap.
They are. They're garbage. But,
I know.
You know, what were the feelings around them in the 1980s? Because if we're talking about tools and their usefulness and their credibility, were they considered to be credible in the 1980s?
I'm pretty sure they were never admissible in court, but I think that police departments did put a lot of stock into them still.
Immediately following Detective Freeman questioning and helping administer this polygraph to Gwen, her girlfriend at the time, Heather, showed up. And as soon as she saw Gwen, she immediately went to her knees and placed her head on Gwen's lap. Detective Freeman describes it as being this very odd and almost controlling scene where Gwen comforts Heather by saying, "I love you, my little puppy. Don't worry, I love you." And Heather just continued to keep her head in Gwen's lap while she was sobbing. Detective Freeman immediately considered the prospect that Gwen was domineering and controlling. Gwen had to be released, though. There was no alternative. There was no evidence. And when when Detective Freeman arrived back to the Walker Police Department after his seemingly fruitless trip to Texas, his his chief encouraged him to drop the case once again. So at this point, after things didn't go anywhere with Gwen, he had another superior encouraging him to drop the case. I want to switch back and talk about another resident of Alpine Manor. Mae Mason was a mother and a grandmother. Stephanie Scruggs, her granddaughter, speaks really lovingly about Mae, and she describes how Mae Mason was brilliant despite growing up poor and without any kind of high-quality education. Mae never graduated from high school, but she always had a deep and sincere love of the fine arts. And Mae would actually take her granddaughter to the Grand Rapids Civic Theater. Mae would work there as an usher, or sometimes she would run the candy counter. And Stephanie and her sister got to spend a lot of time backstage, watching the actors taking part. And Stephanie and her sister would actually paint scenery. For Stephanie, she admits that her grandmother Mae really did a lot of her raising. John Ingman, who is Stephanie, details that her Nana, or Mae, began to have experiences that could be attributed to her Alzheimer's. Stephanie recounts a time when Mae had tried to dry her underwear in the oven, and it led to a fire in the oven that began to spread, and fortunately they were able to put it out. But it was at this time that Stephanie really pushed her mother and father to do something about Mae's safety, and that's when they made the choice to place her grandmother at Alpine Manor. One of the things that Stephanie says that her and her family really discussed heavily was that any place with any kind of supervision has to be better, or had to be better, than Mae living on her own, potentially lighting her house on fire and dying that way.
Yeah, assuming that you don't have anybody on the staff there that is murdering people.
100%. That makes a big difference. John Ingman, Mae Mason's son-in-law and also Stephanie's father, said that the perception that he and his family gathered of Alpine Manor was that it was clean and nice, and that the staff was very personable. They saw no kind of issues. When Mae was first admitted, she was highly cognizant of where she was, and physically she was very healthy. But over time, her mental and cognitive state declined, and they noticed that Mae became jumpy and that she began to experience extreme paranoia. And in fact, Stephanie recounts a time when her Nana said to her, "Someone is trying to kill me," and then later in that same visit, "Please don't make me stay here. I'm scared to be here." However, when Stephanie spoke to the staff at Alpine Manor, they normalized the experiences that Mae was having. A year into living at Alpine Manor, Stephanie and her family had already accepted that to be the truth, that her Alzheimer's disease led to her developing this extreme paranoia, these thoughts and memories of being harmed, these fears of being harmed. And to be fair, those diseases can lead to increased paranoia.
Right.
They can lead to increased fear. However, I'm sure you can already guess that's not the case with Mae Mason.
Yeah, there was also some weird spike in the residents of Alpine Manor developing this paranoia, I imagine.
A collective paranoia.
Somehow since Gwen started working there, and then it dropped off substantially after she moved to Tyler, Texas.
Maybe there was some kind of wild hallucinogen in the facility at the time.
Correlation does not equal causation, though.
I did learn that in stats class. A little over a year into living at Alpine Manor, Stephanie and her family received word that Mae had died peacefully in her sleep. And while the family found it odd and confusing that Mae had passed, although she had recently gotten an outstanding bill of physical health, still found some kind of relief and joy in the fact that Mae was healthy and whole again in the next life and free of dementia, of the disease that had plagued her. Now, just to contextualize, Mae's death occurred roughly a month after Marguerite's death did. So Marguerite died, and then a little over a month later, Mae died. On October 13th, 1988, when Detective Freeman returned from Tyler, Texas, he again reached out to Cathy Wood to see if she would agree to a polygraph. They love polygraphs in this case.
Absolutely.
Detective Freeman noted that Cathy made great efforts to separate herself from Gwen Graham, and during the polygraph, she denied ever having worked as a lookout for Gwen while she was committing the murder of Marguerite Chambers. Cathy...
A lookout is crazy. She was a lookout?
She denied ever being a lookout. She was never a lookout.
But where did that come from? You can't... That's like... I didn't steal the cookies from the cookie jar. Who said anything about stolen cookies?
Interestingly enough, Cathy failed this polygraph attempt. And the polygraph operator, who is named as just Pete, shared that not only had Cathy failed her polygraph, but he believed that Cathy was making up the entire story. Again, another professional telling Detective Freeman that he was wasting his time. At this point, even Detective Roger Kaliniak believed that they had hit a dead end. He hypothesized that Cathy intended to get Gwen in trouble, have her brought back to Michigan, and then when the stakes were at their highest, she would admit up that she made the entire story to get back at Gwen. I don't know what Cathy had in her secret sauce that everyone wanted to believe that she was innocent and making this up. It's so wild that she's sitting here confessing on behalf of Gwen and herself and saying these murders did happen. I did know about them. And everyone's like, no, this is made up.
It's easier to believe that she is making this up as some sort of woman scorned than to think about the reality of people in a nursing home being murdered and being abused because of how susceptible they are to it. It is easier for them to believe that than to believe that the nurses, who I'm sure that they think of as angels working with these people, would actually be harming them. It is easier to digest that than to believe that what Cathy is saying is true.
Yeah, I agree with that assessment. I also wonder if to any degree...
And you have a lot of them.
If to some degree this assumption of falsifying the story was predicated on the fact that these men were uncomfortable with a lesbian relationship dynamic potentially being at the heart of the situation. I wonder if it was still considered to be a mental illness of some kind, what kind of connections they drew from that, what kind of inferences they made. It also makes me wonder, oftentimes when we hear of people doing something truly awful to someone else and we are not prepared to believe it, or it is about someone we know, it's really common to humanize them and say things like, oh, but that's a mom. Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a good mom. Oh, she's this. This is how I know her. She could never do something like this. And I wonder if to some degree, those stereotypes or those misperceptions of sexuality or even gender play a role in believability.
I also think when you're looking at the big picture, this woman who left her husband and entered into a relationship with another woman, the information is coming from her ex-husband, and then she has since broken up with that woman. So now the accusations are coming from her ex-husband about her ex-girlfriend, and there are a lot of exes here. And so it's probably really easy to say, well, this ex is probably trying to get back at that ex by saying X, Y, and Z. I just think that the way that everything has been revealed and the big picture, like you're saying, the discomfort that they may have with a lesbian couple, these women who, how could they possibly not want me? All of that. There are a lot of moving parts in this case that might lend them to be able to kind of sweep these things under the rug and pretend like that's not the case, and it's easier to digest. You're having to do a lot of mental gymnastics to digest it, but it is easier to digest.
Yeah.
Than to accept that these women who have been in charge of the care of this vulnerable population could bring harm on said vulnerable population.
This is related, although a little more tangential. But I think in the process of interviewing Gwen Graham or being face to face with her, she would have been a figure in the 1980s that straight cisgender men might not understand or even necessarily know how to operate with, because she was more masculine. Mm-hmm. She was mulleted up.
Butched down,
mullet up. And she had a real toughness about her. And people who are indoctrinated and investigated and invested in roles of gender performance and dynamic, I think would have a hard time taking a woman who would likely push back as much as Gwen Graham would. Detective Freeman decided that he'd had enough of Cathy's foolishness and half-truths and quote unquote mind games. He placed the ball in her court.
Told you it was a lot of mental gymnastics.
And he told Cathy that when she was ready to come back and be honest about her involvement and provide some type of evidence or credible information, that he would speak with her, but that he would do nothing until then. Detective Freeman even notes that he felt like he was playing a game with Cathy.
This feels stupid.
And that she'd be back. I want you to understand that after I wrote that paragraph, I wrote down, and what the fuck, what a crazy choice.
Because what you're saying is, you're telling me that people were murdered, but you're not giving me enough for me to go off of. So until you can come to me with actual evidence of these murders that you would also be charged with, the murders didn't happen.
Yeah, exactly.
That is insanity.
It is a big WTF. When I heard him explain that himself, I was like, what are you bragging about right now? What are you talking about?
Yeah, he got her.
And
he got her right where he wanted her.
Well, and I guess to his credit,
confused.
3 days
Convoluted mess.
3 days later, Cathy called Detective Freeman again, and she told him that she was ready to tell the full truth. So, Cathy came down to the Walker Police Department and provided a taped confession, and once again completed a polygraph. This time, this is her third polygraph.
She taped her own confession?
She provided a taped confession. I'm sure she did it while she was there. This time, Cathy passed her polygraph. She shared, and this is word for word, we talked about killing people in the nursing home. She talked about Marguerite Chamber, Mae Mason, and others. And Cathy remembered that Marguerite was the most vivid instance of murder. She actually watched Gwen suffocate her. And she also shared that they agreed to start with the patient whose name began with an M. Cathy further explained that the nursing home kept a logbook, a record of every patient who was discharged, either due to death or hospitalization. And her and Gwen had decided that they wanted the book to spell out M-U-R-D-E-R, or murder, using the first initial of each patient's first name.
The U?
Oh.
How many fucking U's are there?
Sorry. There is one.
Of course there is. That's what gave him the idea.
On January 18th, 1987, Marguerite Chambers' name was added to that logbook. On February 10th, 1987, Ursula Bedford's name was added to that book. The next would be Ruth Burns, murdered on February 16th, 1987. Fortunately, the two were not successful in spelling out murder. Cathy shared that part of the reason they set out to kill these typically defenseless patients is so that, open quote, we could never be separated from each other. She, in reference to Gwen, liked that because we'd have something on each other forever, and it was something that would bind us together forever.
That doesn't sound like Gwen at all.
And then Cathy laughs and says, oh God, it's silly, but that's what it is. Close quote. Something about her laughing in the middle of this taped confession about why they decided to murder these people together really aggravated my soul, because for so much of it, I feel like Cathy is trying to portray or convey that she is upset about this, that she is miserable over it, that she's filled with regret and remorse. But I don't know how you laugh at something like that.
Have you never laughed at a funeral?
Sure.
That's the same thing to me. You're in a situation that is way outside the norm. It's uncomfortable. It is ridiculous. I mean, there is a level of ridiculousness to it. It doesn't feel real. I can imagine it does not feel real. The fact that you've even been an accomplice in any of these murders doesn't feel real. And so I can see laughing in the same way that you would laugh at a funeral.
Sure, but I think for someone, and I understand what you're saying, we laugh in moments of discomfort. That's human nature. That's part of processing. But what I think is really abnormal about it is she began this entire sequence of events by sharing with her ex-husband about what happened. And then when she was immediately questioned about it, she wanted to distance herself as much from the situation as possible. And then at the next instance of being interviewed, she wanted to distance herself as much as possible.
For sure.
And I think for someone who was so apparently and obviously trying to avoid as much punishment as possible, to avoid as much responsibility as possible, I feel like there would have been some level of moderation of, I shouldn't laugh while I'm sharing details about why we killed people. So I don't know. I understand what you're saying. I still hate it.
Right, but she's also been sitting with this information before she brings it to her ex-husband.
Right.
For if the first murder was January 1987, she's been carrying this for nearly 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
And probably been replaying these moments of being in an interrogation room or being found out for this. And so I can see laughing because of how bizarre the whole thing feels. Even because she also has probably spent the better part of 2 years trying to mentally distance herself from the reality of what she knows.
Right.
Like double think, where she's aware that she has some culpability in this, and then also that she is trying to pretend like it didn't actually happen, like it wasn't real, so that she can do her best to continue on through her life.
Yeah, I understand that. It kind of goes back to, I think, the conversation we had when we went over Hiroshi Meiiwa's case. And I know this isn't what you're doing. I can't give her a pass for that behavior. Like, it's so distasteful and so sickening that even if there is a reasonable explanation, even if it's common human behavior, I want to remain upset about it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm not saying that it's great or okay.
Right,
I'm not
right.
like, what? You didn't laugh with her? That's not what I'm saying. But
yeah, and I think I feel like we are
saying the same thing.
Yeah,
just dancing around it.
Yeah, which is just that I understand her having that reaction. I don't like that she had it.
Yeah,
which is what you just said, or that you understand people not liking that she had that reaction.
Right. I don't think she liked that she had that reaction, you know?
God, I hope not, but we'll see.
We'll see. Stay tuned for the thrilling conclusion of whether or not Cathy would.
During Cathy's polygraph, she also shared that Gwen wanted to kill many of the people that she and Cathy worked with. I want to point out that if any listener is finding Cathy's behavior and sentiments to be a little odd, you can find copies of her literal video footage of her making these admissions. She then said, quote, "We'd go around and we'd hold people's noses and their mouth. I feel awful," close quote. She also shared that she and Gwen killed 5 people. Cathy's confession transcript was handed over to Detective Roger Kaliniak, and he shared that now they had a solid case. Detective Kaliniak moved to have the bodies exhumed, or the victims' bodies exhumed, as they needed physical evidence.
How many overall victims were there, or that we know of?
5. 5 that we know for sure.
Okay, this is a detail
when
that
I say for sure, none of it is for sure, but I'll get to that. When they began the process of trying to exhume these bodies, they did learn that of the 5 murders that Cathy confessed to, only 2 of them had been buried. The other 3 had been cremated. Marguerite Chambers was one, and Edith Cook was the other. So those were the 2 that had been buried. On December 2nd, 1988, 2 years to the day that Marguerite Chambers had been buried, the police approached Jan Hunderman and Marguerite's family and shared that Cathy Wood had confessed to helping to murder her mother, Marguerite. Detective Kaliniak explained that they needed to exhume her body. One of the saddest moments in this entire documentary episode was when Jan laments and becomes emotional about how her mother had already been tortured, and now through exhumation, she would be tortured again. Disinterring her mother from her grave was a difficult decision, but ultimately, Jan did decide to allow the authorities to exhume her body. Dr. Stephen Cole, the forensic pathologist who worked on this case, explained that his job was to look for something that could clearly explain the victim's death and might be compelling enough to rule out suffocation. So he was hoping to rule out suffocation. There was no definitive proof of natural disease, and there was no clear determinant that could indicate that suffocation was the cause of death. So essentially, from my understanding of Dr. Cole's assessment, is when that body was exhumed, when they reviewed Marguerite Chambers' body and Edith Cook's bodies, there were no obvious signs of some kind of natural event that caused them to die, but there was also no evidence of suffocation or asphyxiation. So both of the things that they were hoping to find to make some kind of decision weren't available to them. This was also an interesting fact that I learned while watching this docuseries, which is that medical examiners across the nation have the authority to change the legal cause of a person's cause of death, even if only due to circumstantial evidence. So since Cathy Wood said that she personally witnessed the suffocation of the patients, Dr. Cole was empowered to alter the cause of death, and ultimately he did so. He changed their causes of death from natural to homicide, specifically to asphyxiation by suffocation. Detective Freeman knew that the media would blow this story up as soon as they got wind, and sure enough, they did. John Ingman, Mae Mason's son-in-law, found out that his mother-in-law had been murdered when reporters showed up at his door asking how he felt about learning that his mother-in-law had been murdered.
So I can't stop thinking about them wanting the record book to reflect the word murder.
Mm-hmm.
But we have Marguerite and we have May, and they only got to E.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened?
I don't know.
Were they spelling murmur?
I don't know. I have no idea. I don't know what happened other than maybe their excitement got ahead of them.
I was thinking in the beginning, which obviously is not the case, but if she liked to play that little game where she suffocated them for fun but not for murder, I kind of thought that the first one wasn't intentional homicide. I mean, it's awful anyway to even suffocate them. Like, that is horrible. But I just kind of assumed that the first one was not done intentionally. It was just like this haha little game that we like to play, and then oops, they died.
Well, and I think you're pointing to this kind of inconsistency that other reporters and analysts have suggested, which is, sure, Cathy confessed to the murdering of 5 people. That doesn't mean that there weren't other murderers or instances of murder that don't stem from these 2. And there are some reports that people believe that 12 people were murdered by Cathy and Gwen. Detectives Freeman and Kaliniak had enough evidence to arrest the 2 women. Detective Kaliniak made contact with Cathy Wood the following day, and he arrested her at her home. Detective Freeman was once again dispatched to Tyler, Texas, where he arrested Gwen Graham. The women were now 25 and 26 years old. The first images and video footage of Gwen Graham left Mae Mason's family, particularly her granddaughter, feeling, quote, very weird. Mae's granddaughter Stephanie commented that Cathy Wood did not look scared in any footage she saw or came across. Jan Hunderman, Marguerite's daughter, shared, quote, when I saw pictures of them on TV and I saw them being arrested, handcuffed, and going to jail, I looked at them both and immediately I thought they must be very mentally deranged to do something like that to that many people, close quote. Ken Kolker, who was by and large the greatest reporter on everything related to this case at the time, reported that people in the Grand Rapids area and the surrounding area were transfixed by this case. It was all that anyone could talk about. One of the things that he points to is that the captivation seemed to stem from, A, crimes like this just didn't happen very often, and it was kind of sick and novel at the same time. And B, he said that people got really hung up on the fact that it was done by lesbians, and there was so little experience with most people and their experience with lesbians. And Detective Freeman, he states that lesbianism played no part in their investigation, that it mattered none to them. I personally have a bit of a difficult time believing that, but by the same token, I understand that sentiment, what he's trying to convey. On September 11th, 1989, at the Kent County Courthouse, Cathy Wood was offered a plea deal so long as she testified against Gwen Graham. Jan Hunderman and Stephanie Scruggs, the surviving relatives of Marguerite and May, shared a lot about their emotional journeys throughout this time period, and Detective Kaliniak also shares that the prosecution's case was very iffy at the beginning of the trial. All they really had was Cathy Wood's statements and her testimony against Gwen Graham, and things didn't look great for the prosecution. It did not look like they would be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that this crime had been committed in the way that Cathy described. However, towards the middle of the trial, Heather Barriger, the lover that Gwen took following her breakup with Cathy, was called forward and provided testimony. While Heather requested not to be recorded, she shared a story that was nearly identical to Cathy Wood's recollection. When Gwen Graham testified, she maintained that she did not commit the crimes of which she had been accused. Gwen had softened her image as well. So in some of these court recordings, her mullet is a little less severe. She looks more feminine, more soft, which I think is a clever thing to do if you're a woman who's being tried for several counts of murder.
Usually your defense attorney is advising you.
Okay, listen, here's what I'm saying. She softened her image, but she had already adopted some very masculine behaviors and posture and movement. And so even though she had softened her physical appearance, there were still elements of it that could not hide that form of lesbianism.
Or that form of masculinity, because I don't
Sure, but that lesbianism manifested that way, from my perception. I think, obviously, it's a surprise to no one that there are oftentimes, when lesbianism goes hand in hand with enhanced masculinity. It's why some lesbians refer to themselves as studs, right? The idea that they present as very masculine, and that's part of their lesbian identity. So I'm not making an effort to conflate someone's gender performance to their sexuality, but I do think that both are responsible for the other.
And I'm here to support everybody.
Okay.
I am your ally. You're a Nazi.
Also, interestingly enough, from the footage of this court hearing and Gwen addressing the court herself, it feels like she makes attempts to manipulate her audience. She wants them to believe a certain persona.
Gwen wants to be the one in control of the room and of the perception and of what people believe.
Absolutely. Gwen again was trying to exert dominance. Fortunately, it was largely unsuccessful. No one in the courtroom went for Gwen's kind of domineering.
They had already seen behind the curtain. They know why they're there. They know what she's being accused of. If you told me, hey, this person murdered somebody, I'm not going to be as inclined to listen to what they're saying if they're trying to convince me that they did not, in fact, murder somebody.
That they are not a murder.
Right.
The jury returned with their verdict. Gwen was convicted on 5 different counts: premeditated murder and conspiracy to commit murder for different victims. Gwen was sentenced to life in prison. 3 weeks later, the details of Cathy's plea deal became public. Cathy was given no less than 20 years in prison, but no more than 40 years in prison, with an option of parole starting at 20 years. In October of 2018, Cathy was paroled early for having exhibited good behavior, and notice was sent to the family members of each victim. Stephanie Scruggs prepared herself to face Cathy once again, 29 years after her first trial. Jan Hunderman's heart sank and was really overcome by this early release and how she felt slighted, how she felt that her mother had been slighted. And one of the things that Jan herself says is she just had 9 years left to go, kind of pointing out
she had 11.
This is literally what she said.
Okay, well,
doesn't mean she's good at math. Stephanie wanted to keep Cathy in jail for as long as she could. On June 3rd, 2019, Cathy Wood had her parole hearing. Cathy's image was displayed on a large projector, and Jan and Stephanie faced the perpetrator once again. On January 16th, 2020, Cathy Wood's parole had been approved, and she arrived at her new home after being behind bars for 30 years in South Carolina. In this docuseries, Jan speaks to the anger that she feels that Cathy was released and iterates that she had hoped that Cathy would die in jail. By the time they had lost the appeal to keep Cathy in prison, Stephanie had already forgiven herself and was less burdened by Cathy's freedom. And I'm not sure if you remember back at the initial discussion around Mae Mason, but Stephanie carried around the responsibility of her grandmother's death.
By putting her in the facility.
Yes.
Yeah. And if we're being honest, that is what Jan is doing as well.
100%.
But like you said, Stephanie forgave herself, and Jan has not come to terms with the fact that she couldn't have known.
No.
She couldn't have prevented these women from doing what they did, but she's not willing to reflect on herself in a way that is going to allow her to move on. Yeah.
Right. Yes, she doesn't have either the emotional skill set or knowledge to free herself of that responsibility through self-examination. Jan Hunderman and Stephanie Scruggs aren't the only people close to the case who believe that Cathy Wood should be punished. Gwen Graham.
I was gonna say Gwen. Gwen's big mad that she wasn't able to control Cathy into not saying anything.
Gwen Graham.
Oh, Gwenny.
Gwen Graham also passionately believes that Cathy Wood should stay behind bars. For Target 8, Ken Kolker reported that Graham said, quote, "I'm telling you, she's an evil person. She's an evil person. Whatever they need to do to keep her there, do it." Graham also continued, "After all these years, I still don't believe that anybody was murdered. I just don't." Close quote.
When she calls her an evil person, what is it that you think that she actually means by that?
Someone who broke their submission to her.
Yeah, exactly. She is evil because I am only sitting here as a convicted murderer because she couldn't keep her mouth shut, because regardless of all the control I exerted over her, regardless of how I forced her to be submissive to me, she told. Mm-hmm. We were supposed to have this thing on each other.
We killed people together, and she still told. I don't think that Cathy, I don't think that she is.
The only reason, in my opinion, that Gwen was not still with Cathy is because it was exhibited when Heather came to the station and knelt down and put her head in her lap. Heather was more docile and submissive to Gwen than Cathy was, because Cathy would go a little bit toe to toe. Cathy liked the volatility of the whole exchange and then what it led to later on. Heather, I don't think Gwen had to be as domineering or violent with Heather, because it seems like Heather was ripe for the picking, wanted to be subservient, and
then Heather double-crossed her too.
Is she also evil? Should she be locked up for 40 years? How did Heather double-cross her? Remind me.
She's the one who offered the additional testimony that ultimately ended up saving the case. She came in and provided that Gwen had shared all the same details that Cathy had to her. Graham also intimates that she was a target for being an open lesbian in the 1980s. She argues that Cathy Wood intended to punish her after she cheated on her and left her for another woman. Quote, "I never understood how just cheating on her, that she would go so way out of proportion to do this to me." Close quote. Ken Kolker, that original journalist who worked this case, reported that Cathy Wood, at the age of 57, had been released, that the conditions of her parole included that she would not be able to return to West Michigan as a resident. However, this stipulation was only temporary. For now, Cathy lives with her sister in Fort Mill, South Carolina, a city of 17,000 people right outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. Ultimately, Wood and Graham killed at least 5 patients and maybe as many as 12. Though the Michigan Parole Board had denied Wood's release 8 times before finally putting her parole through, the MPB believed that Cathy Wood was lacking in remorse and that she could still be a danger to others. Again, in Ken Colker's reporting, he revealed that Detective Kaliniak believes that Cathy was the mastermind behind these crimes. I believe that Cathy Wood was the mastermind. She was the one that was pulling strings on Gwendolyn Graham. He then also went on to say, Gwendolyn Graham handled the dirty work, and Cathy Wood was the brains behind it.
You researched the case. What do you think? I would say, based on the way that you wrote the case, that you don't think that that is what happened, but it could be.
I think, and I was kind of trying to say it earlier, and then I stopped, which is I don't think that Cathy Wood is scrutinized as closely as she should be.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that at the time anyone was interested in investigating Cathy Wood's contribution more. I think they just wanted to arrest someone for the crimes. I think they wanted to charge somebody with the crimes. And I think someone like Gwen Graham, who was maybe more brash, more physically and different than other women in that time period, someone who presented as a masculine lesbian without choice. I don't think she knew how to even soften those traits of this kind of lesbian masculinity. I think she was an easy target. I think if you want a jury to convict somebody in the 1980s, you pick someone who's easiest to other, and that was Gwen Graham. Cathy Wood was a mother. She had come forward and confessed and provided the evidence to make the arrest. And so I also think that she got a sweet plea deal. It could have been sweeter, for sure. 20 to 40 years is not nothing. But I don't think that Cathy Wood gets as much blame as she should.
Okay.
Graham was ultimately convicted of first-degree murder in the deaths of Mae Mason, age 79, Edith Cook, age 98, Marguerite Chambers, aged 60, Myrtle Luce, age 95, and Bella Burkhard, 74. The victims all suffered from dementia or Alzheimer's disease. Wood pleaded to second-degree murder in Marguerite Chambers' death, and then was consequently given her sentence of 20 to 40 years. Kaliniak and Freeman remain at odds in terms of how they interpret Wood's involvement. While Kaliniak thinks that Wood should serve life in prison, something that was never an option though, and believes that she is a threat to the public at large, his former partner, Detective Freeman, believes that Wood has earned her freedom. That was his direct quote, in exchange for her testimony against Graham, and offer that without Wood's cooperation, Gwen Graham would still be free today. In 2020, the South Carolina Parole Board offered that Wood's parole would keep her from caring for vulnerable populations, such as the elderly, children, and other vulnerable adults. However, these terms of Cathy Wood's parole expired in June of 2021. That brings us to current day. Cathy Wood remains to live in existence under the radar. Gwen Graham remains in prison. And Redditors and other web sleuths still form and share their opinions on this case today. There's just a couple I've wanted to share, which the first kind of skeptical Reddit theory is that detectives like Tom Freeman and Roger Kaliniak were skeptical of Cathy Wood's claims. They found it hard to believe that such heinous acts could have been committed without more concrete evidence, even when Cathy confessed. Some investigators doubted the truthfulness of her statements, suspecting she might be fabricating the story to get back at Gwen Graham. And so one of the ideas that you see floated throughout these Reddit message boards is that law enforcement wasn't equipped to handle this case, and they made a lot of missteps, and it didn't bear out the way that it should have. Others on Reddit and other web sleuth forums have expressed doubts about the authenticity of the murders. They point out that the case would have gone undetected if Cathy Wood had not confessed. Again, there's still speculation that Wood fabricated the story to frame Graham, as the physical evidence was circumstantial and largely based on Wood's confessions. Some Redditors argue that the ambiguity of the evidence leaves room for doubt about whether the murders actually took place. Another criticism is essentially that a lot of weight was placed on polygraphs, and of course, we know that they are not reliable. And that's the case of Cathy Wood and Gwen Graham.
It is interesting to me that that there are people who think that there were not murders. Which it seems to me like that is very unlikely, almost impossible to be the actual case, because who was it? Wasn't it Marguerite who had just gotten the clean bill of health, or was that May?
That was May.
May had just gotten, 10s across the board. She was 79. And then she died very quickly. I mean,
when the theory is said aloud, it feels conspiratorial. It feels as if it's something that's too far off from reality. But I do think I can understand the criticism of, sure, you've exhumed these bodies, but they did not produce any strong evidence that this death wasn't natural causes.
I think that's why they chose that means of killing, the suffocation, and to do it so gently, just to hold their mouth closed and pinch their nose, because what evidence would there really be? And when you're talking about a population that is older or suffering with conditions that can speed up the process of dying, it's less suspicious. It's less likely to be investigated. They don't have their medical examiner down there like, okay, let's make sure that this person who was 98 wasn't murdered
with a degenerative disease.
Yeah.
That literally one of its hallmarks is essentially muscle memory loss, the inability to swallow. It could have been the perfect crime.
It could have been. Seems like people think it also could have been the perfect revenge, although I don't know how it'd be perfect if you got 20 to 40 years, but...
Imagine how much you'd have to hate somebody.
You're hoping that you're in the same prison.
Same cell.
The long game to get back together. I had not heard anything about this case before. This was completely new to me.
Well, and I have to give a shout out because this case was recommended to me by one of our listeners, a listener of the pod.
Friend of the pod.
So, Ruby, thank you so much for this case suggestion. It was really fascinating.
It was. I really enjoyed it. If you are still listening, if you've made it this far, and if you've liked what you've heard, please do us a huge favor and share.
Yes, the best way to help us continue to distribute this podcast and make this content is to support us by sharing the good news. Tell your friends, tell your coworkers, tell the person who you pick up DoorDash from. Let them know that they should check out Until the End of Crime.
Your neighbor at the gym on the treadmill.
Your stupid stepsister, your ugly uncle. Tell them all.
Yeah, and while you're doing that, a complete list of sources and any links can be found in the show notes.
And that's all we've got for this episode. If you enjoyed listening and want to hear more, please make sure that you have subscribed and give us a 5-star rating and leave a review, a positive one.
I cannot emphasize this enough. Recommend us to a friend or acquaintance or coworker or somebody that you're passing on the sidewalk. And make sure that you're following us at End of Crime Pod on Instagram.
Like us on Facebook at Until the End of Crime and join our discussion group.
Our email address is endofcrimepod@gmail.com. So send us an email with questions, requests, or episode suggestions.
Thank you for listening.
Until the next crime.